Laura Flores Shaw. Yes, I'll come. I first met Laura when she was running Oak Knoll School in actually just outside of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And at that stage, she'd been in psychotherapy, marriage and family counseling, and had then taken on the running of the Montessori school there. And was deeply engaged in watching the pedagogy unfold and seeing how she could support the work of the children, the parents, and the teachers to really feel that the school was serving their needs. But after that, Laura decided that she was actually a researcher at heart and in actual pursuit, really, of academia and research. And so, having known her initially as Laura Flores Shaw, I'm now able to say that I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Laura Flores Shaw to you. Many of us will know her because Laura has a blog and an organization called the White Paper Press. And this particular service that she offers is to look at the research that is actually out there and give it a rather critical one look and decide whether or not we are promoting something that really doesn't hold up so much, or that this is something that people should actually be looking at. And so that is an enormous service, and if anyone is interested in seeing that, she gathers certain topics together, she looks at the research, and then just does an overview of why this research is or isn't going to be of value to us as Montessorians. So that's the White Paper Press. Just recently, however, she has become an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University and specializes in mind, brain, and teaching. And so I am really delighted to introduce you to Dr. Laura Flores Shaw, because she specializes in looking at research and translating it or making it useful and valuable to our community. Thank you so much, Laura.
Okay, so can everyone hear me? Okay, that's good. I know. What, are you complaining? No, I'm just kidding. I'm just teasing you. Yeah, I know. I felt if I were taller, it would be better. I'll try to move around a little bit. But we're going to talk about resilience today. And first, before I begin talking about what resilience is, I want to ask you a question. And that is, how many of you want to foster resilience in children? Yes. Okay. So I have some questions for you then. How do you know if a child is resilient? How do you know? What does resilience look like? Does resilience vary according to context? It's a little feedback on the... Nope, that's not it. The computer, really? I don't think it would be the computer. Is that better? Okay. So another question. What does resilience look like in privileged spaces compared to non-privileged spaces? And then we need to ask ourselves, resilient for what purpose? And resilient according to whom? To what group? Who decides what's resilient behavior and what's not? So psychologists actually borrowed the term resilience from physics, where it originally meant being able to spring back. So resilient people are those who bend, but they don't break. And to understand resilience, we need to look at the history of resilience as a research construct. And first, we need then to look at the term risk. So the term was originally used in maritime insurance in 19th century England when ships were first being insured, and risk was considered a characteristic of the environment, the ship itself, and the captain. Because if, for instance, you have a captain who likes his drink, right? Or you have a crew that doesn't really like the captain all that much, or the ship springs a leak, all of these are factors that put the journey at risk for failure. So then that means your insurance rates might go up. And then at some point, risk was used in public health, where it was first discussed in terms of environmental risk, and that turned into children being called at risk or high risk. And that perspective was essentially a deficits perspective. It focused on what was missing, what was lacking. And it also became very deterministic in nature. And Emmy Warner, who passed away, I think, in 2017, and I know this picture is a little fuzzy, but she, in a true academic form, there are very few pictures of her on the internet, and so this is the best one I could find. And she was one of the first researchers of resilience in the field. And she said, a risk factor, whether inside of you or outside of you, is a probability, not a certainty. But we treat risk in almost everything we write about as certainty, such as, you are a child of 2 alcoholics. Too bad. And in fact, in her early research and the research of others, it was actually assumed that children in high-risk environments, that they were destined to repeat the lives of their parents. It was assumed that their outcomes would be horrible. But then the data actually came in, and they didn't find that to be the case. They didn't find that these children went on to repeat the same cycles of their parents. And this was so surprising, in fact, that they thought their data actually had to be wrong. But their further analysis and then further studies showed this was actually true. So then the research turned to thinking about vulnerability, which refers to a person's predisposition to develop varied forms of psychopathology or behavioral issues. So this is basically how susceptible you are to developing what are considered negative outcomes under high-risk conditions due to, for instance, your genetics and or your temperament. So vulnerability opens one up to responding to a risk situation in a maladaptive way. Now, you may have heard of these terms, the orchid and the dandelion. Have any of you heard these terms? A few of you. So these terms actually come from Boyce and Ellis. Bruce Ellis is also a researcher in this particular area. And this is a recent book this book actually just came out recently. And you can find, Terry Gross did an interview with him on Fresh Air. And, you know, I don't really like the orchid and the dandelion dichotomy too much because, you know, it's very binary in terms of how we think about things. But basically, orchid children are children who are characterized by heightened environmental susceptibility. Whereas dandelion children, those are children who you can put them in any situation. It doesn't matter what kind of situation it is. They can have the worst conditions and they will be fine. But the orchid children, they are very sensitive to their environment. They have enhanced sensitivity to both negative and positive environments, and this enhanced sensitivity increases developmental receptivity to the environment. So they're very receptive to both positive and negative environments. And this susceptibility, it is biological. So it's a neurobiological susceptibility. And there's great variance between individuals in their biological susceptibility to the influence of the environment, and there's also great variance within individuals. So susceptibility may vary also across the lifespan. So that's vulnerability, right? So orchid children, they have high vulnerability. On the other hand, we have resiliency, which refers to being able to fend off maladaptive responses. And it also means not having then to suffer potential negative consequences of such behaviors. But here's the thing. Because conceptions of resilience within educational contexts assume that conditions exist which students must overcome in order to achieve, the presumption is that resilience exists only when students have been placed in at-risk situations. So resilience in the research literature is something you see only if in your what's considered an at-risk situation. It's not something that is really considered to be in privileged spaces, at least not within the research literature, except that teachers in privileged spaces will talk about resilience, and they will usually talk about it as overcoming little setbacks. Have you heard this in your own environments, maybe? Okay, and now my clicker is not working. Okay. So looking at resilience in the research literature, the question is, now my clicker's not working. Who decides? Who decides which environments are at risk and what behavior is resilient? And then what behavior is maladaptive? And we need to think about these questions because how resilience is conceptualized is central to building resilience interventions. So how we conceptualize it will decide how we build it. But Warner pointed out in 1993, she said that developmental theory was, and to a large extent it still is, based on predominantly Western urban studies that incorporate primarily white middle-class notions of childhood, parenting, education, and life values. So this is a problem because we can't have a dominant group deciding who is at risk, and then the dominant group imposes their ideas and values on that other group. And the dominant group can purport, they can actually have the intention of helping others, but ultimately the way in which they are doing it can reinforce the dominant group's power and control over the others. So we need to consider and keep in mind that resilience may at times actually be a way to maintain, even if we have good intentions, the power and control of the dominant group. And it can also be what I like to go, a squirrel. It's a distraction. Resilience is one of those constructs that can be a way for the dominant group to distract us from dealing with more fundamental issues like, poverty, right? Or institutional racism. Because, see, if we do things like if we focus on helping moms to foster better attachment to their children, then we can make those children resilient to poverty, family instability, parental stress, and depression. Of course, keep in mind that poverty actually may be contributing to all of those things, right? Poverty may contribute to family instability, parental stress, and depression. But if we focus on attachment, we can make these children resilient. Oh, and then we get this added bonus, this added benefit with the boys, that they will be 2.5 times less likely to display behavior problems at school. So this is, again, one way of saying we're going to have an intervention that's going to build this resilience. And this is actually a paper that came out of Columbia University. But it's not suggesting that we actually do something about poverty or other factors that might contribute to family instability, parental stress, and depression. And what we have to remember is that what may constitute risk in one cultural context may not apply to another. Or elsewhere, that risk may constitute a protective factor or process based in specific conditions, cultural values, and norms. So what is considered a risk in one environment may be a protective factor or process in another environment. And this is Michael Unger. He is a very well-known resilience researcher, and he tells us, for many children, patterns of deviance are healthy adaptations that permit them to survive unhealthy circumstances. We call them healthy adaptations, these patterns of deviance, because it allows that person, that child, to survive in their environment. We have to figure out ways to adapt to the environments in which we find ourselves. So when I saw this and I was reading this research and this line in particular, this made me think about something. And I'm wondering if it makes you think about the same thing, but it made me think about this. So Dr. Montessori told us basically that defective characteristics are the result of frustration in not finding the appropriate support in the environment for optimal development. You know, deviations are defense mechanisms created to protect the self from obstacles and oppression. And that makes sense because that's how we're wired. We're wired to adapt so that we can survive. So deviations are defense mechanisms to help with our survival. And Dr. Montessori talks in The Absorbent Mind about how society tends to group children. One, as those whose defects need correction. Two, those who are good or passive and to be taken as models. And three, those thought to be superior. And she tells us that the last two types are really the desirable types. But she tells us that these traits vanish as soon as the children become absorbed in a piece of work that attracts them. The so-called bad qualities, together with the good and the superior, all vanish, and there remains only one kind of child. He has none of these qualities. Instead, the child shows the qualities on the left. And she tells us that society hasn't actually been able to see these qualities in children. So they haven't been able to really evaluate them, right? Yet we make these decisions, these judgments based on good or bad traits of children. But again, what are those judgments based on? Are they based on the dominant groups, in this case perhaps white middle-class adults' views of what's good and bad traits in children? Are they based on our own individual subjective views as educators, based on our experiences? Are we then imposing our own ideas of what resilient behaviors should look like in children? Now, we have identified some things in the environment that are important to resilience, and Michael Unger has conducted this research. It's very significant, and this particular study was conducted at 14 sites around the world. It included 1,451 participants, ranging in age from 13 to 20, and 89 of those participants participated in the qualitative component, where they were able to really have in-depth discussions and interviews with the participants. And what they found, emerging particularly from the qualitative component of the study, is that there are 7 tensions that youth negotiate so that they can thrive despite adversities that they might face in their environments. And all 7 of these tensions were found in every culture, but their influence varied depending on the culture. And later, actually, Unger referred to these tensions as resources provided by the environment. And so it's the fit between the solutions that the youth try, and then how well those solutions resolve the challenges posed by each tension within the norms of each of their communities that contributes to their experience of resilience. And so these are the 7 tensions. Number 1 is access to material resources. So availability of financial, educational, medical, and employment assistance opportunities, as well as, access to food, clothing, and shelter. Those are pretty basic needs, pretty basic resources. Relationships with significant others, peers, and adults within one's family and community. Identity, having a personal and a collective sense of purpose. Self-appraisal, being able to self-appraise your strengths, weaknesses, aspirations, beliefs, values, spiritual and religious identification. Experiences of caring for one's self and others. The ability to affect change in one's social and physical environment in order to access health resources. Cultural adherence is about adherence to one's local and/or global cultural practices, values, and beliefs. There's a social justice tension or resource, experiences related to finding a meaningful role in community and social equality. And finally, cohesion, balancing one's personal interest with a sense of responsibility to the greater good, feeling a part of something larger than oneself, socially and spiritually. And so youth will act in a way to alleviate stresses caused by a lack of these resources, which becomes a source of tension. And so resilience can be understood as a way of life whereby each person finds the best way to resolve the tensions she or he experiences. And we need to keep in mind that these tensions are listed separately. They, of course, are connected, and they impact each other to varying degrees. And one's culture, context, and the person themselves also impacts these tensions, these resources. It's a bi-directional relationship between these tensions and then each individual person, because our genetics and temperament, our neurological propensity to enter into fight or flight, is going to affect our environment. Yet our environment, the specific context we're in at that moment, will also determine resilience. And so resilience is not a fixed trait. As situations or contexts change, so may one's resilience. And ultimately, what this means is that an individual has an active role in the resiliency process because a person can take action to mitigate a stressful situation. And Warner said, "In my opinion, the term resilience has been grossly misused. We have to keep clarifying that we cannot label a person as resilient. It is a process." We understand something about process in Montessori, don't we? Yeah. And so the process is resolving these tensions, these lack of resources in the environment. Because ultimately, resilience is the capacity to be resourceful when faced with adversity. And Unger tells us that what we can do as educators is to remove obstacles to these resources so that they don't become tensions. And Montessori teachers are quite good at removing obstacles, right? Every day you're observing, every day you are observing in the environment to remove obstacles to normal development. This is why observation is so important. We were just talking this morning, I met with the trainers and we were talking about, we would not have this pedagogy had Dr. Montessori not engaged in very systematic and keen observation. Through observing the children, she's been able to predict major things that are coming out in research. So this is how you, as the educators in the environment, are to get your information from the children so you can figure out what obstacles do I need to remove. And you can think of scaffolds and support, but what obstacles do I need to remove? Keeping in mind, of course, that some children may be orchids, and maybe they're orchids in certain situations and not in others. Not every child is a dandelion. And so orchids, again, they may need a little more support. They may need a little more scaffolding. They may need other kinds of obstacles removed from the environment that maybe another child doesn't need. And we remove those obstacles again so that they can have the opportunity to practice being resourceful. And Dr. Montessori tells us, so the child can lose all of his deviations, but the loss of those deviations is not brought about by the adult, but by the child, by himself, who passes into the central line with his whole personality, and this means normality has been attained. And she reminds us that we find this phenomenon repeated unfailingly in all our schools with children belonging to different social classes, races, and civilizations. I mean, think about that, ultimately, Montessori pedagogy, and this is something else we talked about this morning, is a pedagogy of adaptability. And if you have the ability to be resourceful and to resolve those 7 tensions, then you can adapt to any kind of environment that you're in. And Dr. Montessori reminds us, this is the most important single result of our whole work. So you're interested in building resilience, right? You are. You're already building resilience in your students every day. You're preparing environments that remove obstacles to these tensions. And you're doing it at all levels of development. And so when we're advocating for children, and maybe we might hear about some resilience building programs, and we want to advocate for those programs because we think it's important to build resilience in children, we need to ask ourselves, is this program going to remove obstacles to these resources? Or is it furthering the power and control of the already dominant group? These are just good questions to ask ourselves because there's always going to be some sort of unanticipated, unintended consequences of something, right? Another thing we talked about this morning, like we want to advocate for programs that develop executive functions. We have evidence that we know, for instance, that we are doing that. We haven't really talked about exactly the mechanisms behind that, But executive functions, this is a very popular construct in education right now. It's only going to get more popular. But when I read about executive functions in conventional education, the intentions are super good, but what I see is this is going to turn into compliance. That's going to be an unintended, unanticipated consequence. So when we're talking about executive functions in our community, we need to talk about it in a way that's not just about top-down intentional control, but it also talks about from the bottom up automatic behaviors that we engage in. That's a whole other talk. But again, we can support these ideas like, yeah, we want to build good executive functions, but we're probably going to really come at it from a completely different way than they're going to come at it from conventional education, where it's really going to be helping children to change their thinking. That turns into control, trying to change the child. We're not trying to change the children. We're not doing something to them. We are working on a prepared environment. We're thinking in a more systems perspective. And speaking of systems, there is something else that we need to do to foster resilience in children. And so Montessori tells us that the real preparation for education is the study of one's self. You, as the educators, are a self in this system, in your school system or your organization's system, whatever your position is. And she tells us the training of the teacher who is to help life is something far more than the learning of ideas. It includes the training of character. It is a preparation of the spirit. And to discover defects that have become part and parcel of his, the teacher's, consciousness requires help and instruction. Now this makes sense. Let's think about what this means. So we're supposed to self-reflect and self-evaluate, and to discover defects that have become part and parcel of our own consciousness. And we may need some help with that. So how do we support that in our environments as adults? Because, we have this expectation that the children are going to support one another, and they're going to kind of show each other where they might need a little help, right? But not in a shaming way, right? We expect them to help each other. So how are we doing that as adults? Do we have a situation where we have an expectation for the children in the environment, but we aren't living that expectation ourselves? Right? How are we, if our environments, based on how we prepare the environment and we foster this community culture and for the children, this is building resilience. Resilience is a byproduct of that environment. So how are we living that environment as the adults? Or are we only living it when we're in the classroom with the children? But the moment we step out of the classroom when we're in a faculty meeting, are we continuing to live that? Are we building that resilience in ourselves and each other? And the reason this self-reflection and self-evaluation is so important is, and when we can allow others to help us with that, because self-evaluation, self-reflection can be very difficult sometimes. It's like looking at a museum painting like this and trying to get perspective on it. But she's telling us that we can begin to see what gets in the way between us as the adults and then our ability to truly see the children. And she said, the adult must find in himself the hitherto unknown error that prevents him from seeing the child as he is. So how are we looking at things like resilience? What behaviors are we expecting to see? Are we labeling a child who can't deal with little setbacks too well, maybe because they have more of an orchid type of neurological propensity? Are we then labeling them, but then not, are we doing what's necessary to help them? Or are we just kind of labeling them and then going, it's a parent's fault because the parents are too indulgent? Right? The parents are, somebody was using this term yesterday in a discussion, lawnmower parents. Or if you're in Canada, it's snowplow parents, because, you got to move the snow out of the way. So, and the biggest error that we will make is that we will unconsciously act as if the children are empty vessels. And so this is why we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about resiliency, what does that look like to us? And are we imposing that on the children in some way? When really what we need to be doing is what we've always been doing, which is removing those obstacles. But are we imposing our thoughts, feelings, and experience onto the child without even realizing it? Because Dr. Montessori reminds us that we can do that. We can at times, decide what we're going to do to advocate for the child, to help the child. And we may not be realizing that we're actually kind of treating the child in that moment like an empty vessel. And she said the worst part is that when we're doing this, we may feel a conviction of zeal, love, and sacrifice. So it feels good to us, but it's really not what the child needs in that instance. And as we self-evaluate and we self-reflect and we think about, are we fostering that, whatever, resilience in the adult community too? When things, how are we helping one another? How are we removing obstacles? How are we showing one another when we're acting in ways that are not resourceful? But ultimately what she's reminding us to do is we need to then, once we have self-evaluated and self-reflected, and we need to keep doing that. That's a common practice. You don't think, okay, I got it all figured out. It's a continuous kind of practice so that you can see each and every child for who that child is. And she said, turn your attention from me in the direction in which I am pointing to the child. So see the child who is before you. And so ultimately, I don't have, this is the magic bullet to building resilience. The message of this talk is that we need to ask ourselves some critical questions. We need to ask questions of programs that are claiming to build resilience, because this is a really hot topic again. And what we don't want to do is inadvertently advocate for programs that are really going to, that are really about power and control in the end, even if they don't intend to be. This is how we are going to advocate for the children. And in building the resilience in children, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, and we're going to remind ourselves to be more conscious in our practice, so we can see each child and determine what that particular child may need at that particular point in time.